Okay, so for this first video today for our non-fiction people, we're going to be looking at some basic persuasive techniques. Now, we've got this lovely mnemonic here, P in a forest, which the junior kids absolutely die laughing over, but it's basically just an acronym that will help you to remember a bunch of different persuasive techniques if ever you get stuck and need something to remind you of what some persuasive techniques are. So let's get started. These are the basic techniques that P in a forest stands for. So P for personal pronouns, A for alliteration, F for facts, O for opinions, R for repetition, E for emotive language, S for statistics, and T for three. It's in the rule of three. But as you'll see as we go along, there are a couple of instances where the letter stands for more than one technique. So P for personal pronouns, what do we mean by that? So this is a persuasive technique that uses personal pronouns like we, you, us, and they to strengthen, befriend, unite, and sometimes also to separate. So an example of that there is changing from I'm going to beat you up to we're going to beat you up. What this technique does is it automatically forges a bond between you and your audience. It gets them on side and it starts making them think about how you and they are similar. It creates, as it says there, that feeling of unity, which can be a very powerful technique when you're trying to persuade someone because you want them to be feeling like you're on their side. So another example, instead of saying you can do this, saying something like we can do this. I know it says there we will help you, but I think even just changing it to we can do this is a really strong example of how changing a personal pronoun can make a big difference in that feeling of unity and connection there. So have faith in us, together we will succeed is another example, poorly punctuated one. I apologise, this is not my PowerPoint. And I probably should have edited that first, but never mind. So those that aren't here will miss out, they will fail. So this is an example of personal pronouns being used to separate. So it's again, it works by grouping you and your audience together. Those that aren't here will miss out, they will fail. But you and I, we are here together. We're the same. We're part of a team. Everybody else is different. So you can see how immediately those personal pronouns work to start getting your audience on side with you as though you're a team, which is a really strong position to come from if you're trying to persuade them of something. So next is A, which is alliteration, which hopefully you remember from your poetry days, means words beginning with the same sounds. So slippery, slimy, slug is a good example there. Now, the really important thing about alliteration is to know whether the sounds that you are using are hard sounds or soft sounds. And you can hear straight away slippery, slimy, slug, and it's a fairly soft sound, okay? Whereas if you were saying big bad Ben, for example, B is a stronger sound, it's a harder sound than a soft S. And there are actually physiological reasons for that based on how we make the sound in our mouth. But don't get too caught up over that. Just realize that if you're using soft sounds, it's more likely to come across as being potentially positive, and it's likely to be more subtle in its effect. Whereas if you have a really strong sound with your alliteration, it's going to sound quite jolty and jagged, which can cause negative associations with what you're talking about. But from the perspective of someone trying to persuade, it can definitely be a positive thing, because if you are, for example, wanting to convince everybody that a certain thing is bad, then using hard sounds in your alliteration is a good way to work at that subconscious level in the minds of your listeners and start creating sort of a harsh feeling connected with that idea that you're talking about. So F is for facts. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Facts are things that can be checked out. So looking for phrases like we know, it has been proved, research has shown. Statistics are often a sign that facts are being used as well. Experts being quoted. But remember that, like anything else, facts can be used to facts can be spun to suit the speaker or the writer and to suit their agenda. So as it says at the bottom there, if a doctor has researched it for years, says it is, does that make it a fact? Well, that can depend, because we know that research isn't always necessarily unbiased. It depends on who's funding the research as to what results can be found. And there are all sorts of other complicating factors like that that mean that facts aren't necessarily as unbiased as we would like them to be. Nonetheless, they're a very powerful persuasive technique, because if you can put facts forward, particularly convincing statistics, then people are obviously more likely to assume that you have done your research, that you know what you're talking about, and that you are coming from a knowledgeable perspective and a position of strength in terms of your argument. O for opinion. This is the opposite of facts, where facts can be very appealing because it appeals to people's logic. Opinions can also be very persuasive because they appeal to our emotions rather than our facts and our logic. So for the people writing the editorials, this is all about opinion, because it is an opinion piece, obviously, and the purpose of your piece is to try to persuade your audience of your particular perspective on your piece. So we're looking out for phrases such as "I believe," "this may mean," "it can be argued that," things like that, that indicate some sort of spin or bias on it. So things like, "it can be argued," is basically just a way of saying, this is one perspective, this is one side of it, this is one way of interpreting these facts. And often opinions do get paired with facts, so we get presented with the facts on the one hand, and then we get an interpretive opinion following that up and telling us how to interpret those facts and apply them to the argument at hand. So R is the first one that stands for multiple different things. We've got repetition, reiteration, and rhetorical questions here. Repetition and reiteration, just to remind you of the difference there, repetition is repeating exactly word for word, whereas reiteration is just restating the same idea. And a rhetorical question, hopefully you know, is just a question that is not designed to be answered by the audience. It's just designed to make them think about the topic. So repetition is pretty easy to spot. Reiteration can be a very powerful persuasive technique, particularly in speeches. Repetition can be powerful as well, in that it can create like a tagline or a catchphrase or something like that, but it can be overused very easily, so you've got to be very careful about that. And it's probably not so appropriate for an editorial piece. It's probably better for something like a speech that's a little bit less formal. Reiteration, on the other hand, is something that we use in most forms of communication, because we state our ideas in the introduction, we flesh them out in the middle, and then we repeat them again at the conclusion to remind people about our main ideas. So we actually reiterate a lot when we're discussing things in a formal context. So that's something that will appear quite frequently, and hopefully that'll be in your responses regardless of whether you did it there deliberately or not. Rhetorical questions, so as I said, hopefully as you know, is a question the audience can't reply to but makes you think about the answer. Why is it when you phone the wrong number it's never engaged? An example of a rhetorical question there. Now, like repetition, rhetorical questions can be very powerful, but they can also be very, very overused. So don't rely on rhetorical questions. And having rhetorical questions in your introduction can be a good way to get your readers' attention, but it can also be frustrating if you're just asking too many questions and not suggesting that you're actually going to be able to give the answer to them. And likewise, in the conclusion, if you spend too much time in your conclusion asking rhetorical questions, then the reader is left feeling like, well, you didn't actually conclude anything. You never actually made a point. You just raised all these questions and never did anything with them. So definitely you can think about using it, but be very judicious about how often you use it, and be very deliberate about when you're using it, know why you're using it. And that's something that you can definitely talk about in your rationale as well. E also stands for two different things: emotive language and exaggeration, for which the formal term is hyperbole. So emotive language is using words that are specifically designed to key into people's emotions. They're words that can be quite controversial sometimes, and they're words that are sort of like buzzwords that have an inbuilt emotional response to them, that everybody's kind of conditioned to respond in a certain way. So in Western society, for example, things like freedom and democracy and the importance of the individual. We're all conditioned in our Western society to think that these are positive things and to accept unquestioningly that someone who supports democracy, oh, it must be a good thing, right? So if you're using words like that, it's using emotive language that's designed to sort of bypass the logic circuits and shortcut to creating either a positive or a negative feeling in your audience. The thing to be wary about, obviously, with emotive language is overusing it. If you use it too much, then you come across as fairly immature sometimes. It's important to balance the emotive language with more rational, factually based persuasive techniques as well, because otherwise you can lose the substance of your argument to just trying to appeal to people's emotions, and it can sometimes be overused as a way to try and cover the fact that there isn't actually any substance to the argument that the person is trying to make. So just be careful to use a balance with that if you're going to use that one. So an example of exaggeration or hyperbole is there in black at the bottom. I beg you to listen and remember, pea in a forest, you need to pass this exam. It's a matter of life and death. Obviously, it's not actually literally a matter of life and death. That's an exaggeration. So that's an example of hyperbole. And again, it can be effective in small doses, but be wary of overusing that one too much, particularly if you're writing in a more formal style. So probably less appropriate for an editorial piece. S is for statistics. Not quite sure why we've got, that should be simile up there in the header next to statistic. We're missing the L. Oh, the LES is there, it's just in white, so it's very difficult to see. So that does actually say statistics and then similes. So statistics are pretty obvious. You're looking for things like numbers to back up views. 1 in 10 people surveyed said this about that. And similes being used to heighten their description and add to the persuasion. So, 96% of students who don't use pea in a forest fail. You should probably use it then. Fail the exam and cry like irritating little babies. You can see there the word like, an indicator of the fact that this is indeed a simile that we're looking at here. And finally, T is triadic structure or triples. So this is that rule of 3 that was mentioned earlier on there. So looking out for sentences that use 3 adjectives such as blah, blah, and blah. For whatever reason, the human brain is sort of wired to latch onto this idea of 3s, and it can actually be a really good way to help your readers or your audience to remember a point that you're trying to make. If something's repeated 3 times, then it's usually going to stick in your audience's mind more easily. And actually, interestingly, Shakespeare often repeats himself 3 times quite a lot. And the reason that he did that is because he was, in effect, presenting to 3 different audiences. He had the wealthy aristocracy, he had the middle class merchants, so to speak, and then he had the lower classes as well. And so often when you're reading his work, you'll find that he does actually repeat ideas 3 times in different language. He reiterates them, another technique from back at R. And he does so 3 times to pitch it at the 3 different audience levels, and also to increase the chances of his audience understanding his point. So students who don't use pea in a forest fail, get upset, and then they cry. List of 3. So it also works with sentences, and you'll hear this quite a lot in political rhetoric because it is a very powerful tool. So vote for me because I care. Vote for me because I'm the best. Vote for me and I'll never let you down. Somewhat in a similar vein to, I came, I saw, I conquered. So at the end here is just another little list of some other poetic techniques that haven't been, some that have been covered. So we've covered things like personal pronouns, rhetorical questions. Chatty style can also be used, so speaking to the reader in a friendly way that sort of assumes that you are friends and that you're on a level with them, and sort of making that connection and making that relationship. But again, you have to be careful with that one because you've got to really know who your audience is. If you're pitching to, a highly educated audience on a very technical subject, you probably don't want to get too chatty because it's just going to make your audience feel like you don't actually really know what you're talking about. In that case, they're more likely to respect your opinion if you actually come across as being competent and efficient rather than chatty and personable.